The Prime Minister's comments being watched very closely in the currency market. And let's get a little bit more perspective on what's going on with the Canadian dollar. Adam Button is the chief currency analyst at ForexLive, and he's here with a little more reaction to those comments. What could that mean for the Canadian dollar?
Right, I think the market is reluctant to price in a NAFTA deal until the ink is dry. There's just no trust with Trump and the American administration, but you have Trudeau saying significant progress. We've heard that from Trade Minister Freeland as well. There is a lot of good news on NAFTA. I'd say it's a 95% likelihood now, and the Canadian dollar just hasn't shown that quite yet.
So you have this comment from the Prime Minister, and earlier in the program we highlighted the comments from Larry Kudlow, the new economic chief to the president, late yesterday, where he talked about NAFTA, and he highlighted that NAFTA basically is progressing. I'll read the quote. It's, "I think you're going to see some very positive news on NAFTA and maintaining NAFTA and reforming NAFTA. The stock market's going to love that." So that's quite a 1-2 punch.
It absolutely is. And Kudlow yesterday was saying, too, that China isn't going to be a trade war. It's all negotiating tactics. I mean, he's kind of showing America's hand there. So I think we're set up in the next little while to have a lot of positive sentiment, both in the Canadian dollar and in stock markets. So it's really starting to come together after some very tough days.
Okay, we've talked about the U.S., we've talked about Canada. NAFTA has a third partner. It is Mexico. You've been watching some of the wording and the posturing on the Mexican front. What are your observations?
See, Trump really needs a win with Mexico, right? And they want to get this done before the end of the month. So Mexico isn't going to roll over. But you have this caravan that Trump brought up, and he brought up NAFTA at the same time. He's tied these two issues together. Now, have you ever heard of a caravan of immigrants from Mexico before? If you're like me, this was the first time you'd heard of it when he brought it up. And it really seems to me as though this is a bit of a pawn in the whole negotiation. These are Honduran immigrants, migrants coming to the United States. There's 1,000 people. Now, there are 20,000 people a month who get into America illegally, another 20,000 who are caught. So it's really a drop in the bucket. But I think the Mexican government says, fine, we'll give you this. It doesn't even really hurt us. They're Hondurans, not Mexicans. And we'll break this up. We'll say some tough things about immigration. And you can declare victory, a little victory, at the same time that you announce a NAFTA deal, sort of bury the NAFTA deal and say, we made a deal. Because NAFTA, I think, is happening. He's decided he wants to fight with China, not with Mexico, because he really can't win.
Okay, so we've heard all sides, and there definitely seems to be some momentum here. What does that mean for the loonie? Would there be momentum for our dollar?
Right. I think the Canadian dollar should be about 2 cents higher right now. Seasonally, it's a very strong time for the Canadian dollar. Again, you have risk appetite picking up. Technically, the Canadian dollar looks very good. And a NAFTA deal is almost a done deal, I would say, at this point. So you have this tailwind that's going to come for the next couple weeks for the Canadian dollar, and it's going to look very good.
The problem with these trade talks, you say almost a certainty that we'll see a done deal. A version of the more complicated trade talks, I would imagine, that we've talked about. Sort of, is it a surface level done deal, or truly everybody on the same page?
That's why everybody's been burned so many times on the almost deal. Even announcing a deal doesn't necessarily mean a deal. And there will be some snags later on. But they have this deadline with the Mexican election, and they just have to meet it, I think, at this point, because a leftist is going to take over in Mexico, is way ahead in the polls, and I don't think they want to try to renegotiate NAFTA with him. So it's really now or never for Trump's administration.
Is China a wild card in all this, even though that's a completely separate trade battle, if you will?
I don't think it is. I think part of the NAFTA deal is Trump coming to Canada, or someone from the U.S., Lighthizer, and saying, listen, we're going to gang up on China together, and you've got to be with us if you want a NAFTA deal. And Canada, looks at the field and says, we don't really have a choice. We have to stick with America, and if they want to have a little battle with China, fine. That's the price we're willing to pay. And I think maybe later in the year, if that ramps up, and if there isn't an easy deal to be made there, then Canada will suffer as well.
Final question about the Friday jobs report. Everyone will be focusing on what it tells us about the Canadian economy, what it tells us about the U.S. economy. how will the currency market react?
Right. It's all about those wages numbers once again this month in Canada and the U.S. The market is in the middle of a rethink about inflation. You know, we talked about, you were just talking about dividend stocks, and they're starting to come back a little bit because of less fears of inflation. And, you know, bond yields have come down. And however, if we see strong wage growth in Canada, in the United States, I think there are going to be some fresh fears on that. And that will push interest rates up and maybe the Canadian or U.S. dollar. But risks are on both sides ahead of those numbers.
Okay, so 80 cents is kind of the level you're watching for in the next, call it, couple of weeks?
Yes, absolutely. By the middle of the month, towards the end of the month. I mean, tomorrow is a very big day in terms of the data, but that's the ebb and flow of, you know, it's unpredictable data, and it's not easy to get an edge on it.
All right, Adam, great to get your perspective as always. Thanks for joining us. Adam Button with the latest on the currency markets.